when I say rough upbringing, I didn't feel that way as a kid, but I went through some really rough stuff. I love my parents. We had a great relationship, and when they passed, but we had some pretty rocky roads. But I've been on a journey, and one of the things that's been super important to me is family. So who I am first and foremost. I'm a husband of 21 years. I've taken that very seriously from the day that we got engaged, and I take I don't like using the word pride, but I take a lot of joy in just being the best husband that I can be. And then I'm a father of three boys, one of whose story we'll dip into a little deeper here in a bit. But being a dad has been a really big deal. And so for me, everything else is kind of flows out of that. And I've just been on a really long journey of some really great pinnacles. I've experienced some wonderful, experiences and successes. And then we've had some pretty hard hits along the way as well. So, I just like to say I'm a great dad. I'm a great husband. And I can say that. Actually, I usually say I'm a deliriously happily married man of 21 years because it's just hard to say. and then I would say that, I'm someone who has always been interested in getting better and growing as a human being.
Yeah, yeah. And I told you before we started recording, I listened to another interview that you did. I've actually listened to a few interviews that you've done, and there are parts of your story when I listen to it, I think, oh man, I relate to that. I relate to what he
Yeah.
felt or experienced, or what I think you may have felt or experienced. But it almost feels to me, and we can get into the specifics, and I'll let you kind of guide me here, but it almost feels to me like you are built to do the work you do now. You were built to write the book you wrote, and you're built to tell these stories. You're battle tested. But maybe the most appropriate place to start is when you were younger, and then we could build from there. Or you pick. If that's not the best place to start, you can pick another.
Yeah. No, I think we can, because I'll give away just this little piece right here, and then we'll build backwards from it. The funny thing was, you're going to hear here in a second, part of my story that would tell you that I was not equipped to help anyone, to help anybody. And yet my entire life, even when I was in some of my darkest days and some of the things that I was personally setting myself up for failure with drug abuse and different things we'll talk about, even back in those days, people would just open up to me. I mean, strangers would just tell me stuff, intimate things about their life. And I always wanted to help. I just didn't have the wisdom or the insight or even the life experience in many cases to be very helpful. But it is funny how, even when I felt like I wasn't equipped, it's like that was what I was supposed to do. And then, fortunately, over the course of time, I've gained some wisdom and some insight and understanding, and I actually help people now. So,
Yeah.
but we can start with that. For me, I grew up in I say sunny Southern California because that's what it was like. It was a great place to grow up. I lived in kind of northern LA County. People who know the area, it's called Santa Clarita now. And I was, I don't know what we were. I mean, middle class, I guess, back then, maybe lower. We weren't upper middle class. But we had a house, and we actually had a pool. It wasn't like this big estate. We had a very small 2-bedroom home, but we had a pool, dude, and that was pretty awesome. And I grew up playing mostly a lot of baseball and football were my two sports. So that was, a big part of my childhood is just sports and swimming and, friends and, just normal stuff. Well, I think what I didn't recognize at that time was, my parents would have some pretty big blowouts, and, we had we had the pool. So we had a lot of pool parties, and they, obviously drank and stuff like that. And I think I didn't notice the cues along the way that maybe the ship wasn't right. And so I think one of the big catalysts that happened that kind of sent my life in the wrong direction was when I was about 11, between 11 and 12, my dad ended up cheating on my mom. And of course, that's always a significant blow. But I think what may have been a little more unusual is at that age, they had me very late. They'd already been married over 25 years by the time I was 11. So it was, and I should point this out too, they came from a different generation. They got married when my dad was 18, my mom was 16. He fought in Korea. He was in the military, fought on the ground troops during that space. And so, they grew up in a kind of a different generation than of course I did. And so along with that, she was devastated, as you can imagine. It was the only man she ever knew. And so ultimately where that led was he decided to move out. and go hang out with this other girlfriend. And he happened to have a son that was about 2 years older than me, so really close in age, which, that had an impact. It was very awkward. And I have an older brother, but he's almost 8 years older. So he'd already moved out. So he'd been gone, and lived about 8 hours away. So I'll just fast forward through this because I can tell this part of the story fairly quickly and still give it some justice. Over the course of about 2 years, we went through hell on earth, and there was a lot of really bad situations. Ultimately, after 2 years, they ended up getting back together. They ended up being married for over 65 years. They passed away about 9 years ago, about 6 months apart, and I had a great relationship with him in my adult years. But what happened during that 2 year phase is, my mom didn't know how to handle it, started drinking very heavily, tried committing suicide multiple times. Taking pills, drinking too much, saying she was going to do it, and I am 11, 12 years old. She's telling me stuff that I shouldn't hear, really intimate details about their relationship that nobody wants to hear. Right. I mean, most of us don't even like seeing our parents, give affection, so it's like, I don't want to know that,
Right.
so there was a lot of that stuff. And so twice she almost, took me with her. Once was in a speeding vehicle when she was drunk. We spun out on a little 2-lane road that was very dangerous. And, many people did die on that road back when I was growing up. And we somehow, going about 65, spun out and didn't hit a tree and got home safely. And another time she actually fired a weapon. My dad had come to pick me up because I got in a big blowout with her over her embarrassing me really bad, publicly, being intoxicated. And he picked me up. We started to walk towards the car and we heard a gunshot, And so went in, found her in my closet and began to wrestle the gun away. I jumped on top of, her and just started screaming, "You're going to shoot me. You're going to shoot me," And so there was those things. Now, Dave, here's the thing. Even at that age, consciously, I didn't really think about those things as being extraordinary. It was just, I guess I was just kind of raised at that phase of my life of, things just happen and you just trudge through it. Right. So I didn't really recognize, in those early years, of course, what kind of damage that was causing, especially to my subconscious. But to fast forward through the rest of that story, we moved to Montana from LA, which was a crazy experience. I had hair down to the edge of my shoulder, and I was not well received in rural Montana with the kids there. We only ended up there for 2.5 months. My dad actually left us. He was supposed to be going to work, and he went and got on a plane. So went back to his girlfriend again. I mean, there was a lot of ups and downs during that 2 year season. And so, basically what the significant part of that was is I ended up, beginning to abuse drugs and alcohol by the time I was 13 years old. And that continued really all the way up into, I would say, until I was about 31 years old, where, I was functional. But even when I got in the car business when I was 21 years old, because I wanted to make more money, and that's where I was exposed to meth. So I started, snorting meth and abused meth for almost 9 years. And so, and it's funny, Dave, because usually when you bring up you did meth, they automatically think of what I think of, because where I grew up at that point, I was living in Northern California. When you think of a meth head, you're thinking of some dude with more tats than I have and rotted out teeth, pushing his bike through the park with his 3 belongings, right? And it wasn't like that. I was a professional salesperson and I did reasonably well. But I abused meth. I'd go sometimes 3 days without any sleep, and it was just brutal. And so to take us, kind of past that story, but it was very foundational to how I would respond to life. I ended up getting in a marriage. It was a complete train wreck, as you can imagine, because so far I've done nothing to demonstrate to you that I was husband material, right? And after 5 years, that imploded. And it was coming out of that divorce. I'm a man of faith, I'm a Christian. I became a believer at the tail end of that marriage. And I felt like that was something that really began to set me on a much healthier course of life, but still experience the divorce. And then I ended up moving away from California to Texas to kind of start over. And that's when my life began to take a completely different trajectory.
Wow. Let me go back.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking about when your parents, you said that there was a time where you were happy growing up. It sounds like
Yeah, absolutely.
a relatively normal childhood until I think the first time, based on what you're saying, the first time you felt like something might be a little off is when your dad left. But prior to that,
Right.
there was you said there were signs. And if I think back, I don't have the same experiences as you, but we had a pretty volatile house.
Yeah.
And it was normal, and it never felt volatile until somebody else came into it. Or I went somewhere else. Then I realized, well, this is not like my house. And the threats of suicide were common. So, my mother, I can't even tell you how many times would threaten to kill herself and finish pills or not wake up in the morning or,
Yeah.
dump us off somewhere so she could go kill herself. Like, it was a very normal dialogue. And the first time I heard it, I don't even really remember, but I just remember begging her to not do that
Yeah.
and crying and crying and crying. And then it got to the point where it happened so much that I stopped caring, or I detached from it. I detached from it and almost would dare her as the years went on because I got and it led to almost like an unhealthy independence and maybe a little bit of reckless behavior as I got older. And I was listening to your story and I'm like, is that what was going on with you? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I think it's a lot of that. When it first started, dude, I was just trying to be a regular. We call it junior high here in Texas. They call it middle school, but I was just trying to make it through junior high, dude. I mean, that's it. So even when something would blow up, I would start the next day just kind of fresh, like, okay. Now I will say this to your point. I do think without question that, once I began to be able to look back at that experience with fresh eyes and health and a healthier, mindset, there's no question that that's when I'm on my own. I'm going to make all my own decisions. I will do what I want to do. And you won't tell me anything, even though I'm still only 13.
Yep.
It started then.
Yep.
And so I never attributed some of the behavior that I would exhibit a little bit later on, which I'll give you in a second, until many years later when I was able to look back. But there's no question, at first it was just trying to survive. And then it was, and I hate to say it this way, because again, I had a good relationship with my folks as time went on, but it was kind of like, well, screw you, do what you want to do. Then I'm going to go do what I want to go do. And so, I was never, simple things. I was never grounded for anything. There'd be threats, but I think ultimately, and I never asked my parents about this. That's one not big regret, but I kind of wish I'd asked them about it. But I think they just probably felt guilty for everything that they put me through. And so I was never really held accountable to anything.
Yep. Same. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So when you started to party a little bit, was it drinking to meth, or was it usually there's a
yeah. Was it a slippery slope or was it a freight train? Yeah, exactly. Well, to meth, there was a pretty good distance from when I started with beer, because that's what my parents had around. And they would have parties. And my brother, at that time, when I first started drinking, he was around more. And so I had access through him as well. So there was, various ways I was able to get it. So it started with that. But then by the time I was probably 14, I had friends that started smoking pot. And then it was, this is the easiest way to say it, Dave. If it didn't involve a needle, I was more than willing to give it a go. I mean, I'm not proud of that. I shouldn't be laughing about that, but that's just the truth. I was always game for just about anything, but I hate needles. So, was never going to do heroin. Right. But I tried, I did, the pill form of methamphetamines, stuff like that. Cocaine, all those things in my early teens.
Yep.
Meth didn't come around, and I don't even know. I'd have to look back. I don't know if it's because it maybe just wasn't a thing yet, because we're talking about the early 80s right now. But by the time I was 21 years old in the car business, meth had become a thing. And so that's when I was introduced to that. But I went from 0 to at least 80 pretty quickly, because the booze turned into pot, turned into, Quaaludes, mushrooms, whatever, pretty quickly.
Right. And at any point during that time, were you questioning your decisions, or were you so just so caught up in the moment and the partying and the fun that you didn't even contemplate it?
No. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a fair way to say it. I think so. I think there was two things that were happening. I would say from the time I was 13 and started getting into that lifestyle, up until, again, probably, in my close to 30 years old. And that was just simply, I was an athlete. And when I say an athlete, I'm not talking elite. I'm not, trying to tell, old war stories, but at the levels I played at, I was an all-star. I was all league. I was successful, broke school records and certain things. So I had success in the level that I was in. And so for me, that was the thing I was good at. So as long as I was playing sports, even if it wasn't, there was a period of time where after my second year of junior college football, I blew up my knee again for the second time. I had my second catastrophic knee injury. So trying to compete at a higher level and go to maybe a D1 or D2 school was done. I would start competing in very high level competitive softball and, just different things. So if I was competing and partying, for me, that's who I am. And even though, at that time I probably weighed 100, well, about what I do now, actually about 170, 175, I could outdrink most people, even bigger dudes, and that was just kind of my persona. I was an athlete and I could party everybody under the table, which is really nothing to I don't have any plaques or any awards for that. I don't know how that happened,
But I did hear you say in the last interview I listened to that you said something to the effect of you were disgusted with yourself, which
There came a point, yeah.
when? Because
Yeah.
I'm sure, like you said, you were having fun. You weren't trying to, you were probably self-medicating, but at the same time, you were having fun.
Yeah.
So you probably weren't consciously self-medicating, but at some point you got to a place where you said, I'm disgusted. What changed?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that. This is the part of the story that is my least favorite to share, but it's just simply the truth. And so, it's part of my story, like it or not. But and this ties back into what I was alluding to that I would talk about in terms of I didn't realize what kind of an effect that my dad cheating and all the things that I went through would have on my subconscious mind. When I started dating, the one thing that would turn me from the center of the party, Mr. Jokester, everybody loves being around me kind of thing, to who is this dude, violent, especially verbally, was if somebody cheated on me or threatened to cheat on me. And so throughout relationship after relationship after relationship, it was a train wreck after train wreck after train wreck. And then, I actually, gosh, I really hate this part of the story. I was engaged twice before I got married that first time. And one of those lasted 24 hours. So again, I'm giving you no evidence that I was husband material, because I was not. But first, I wanted a relationship, but it seemed like I would attract people who cheated on me.
Yeah.
And what I believe to be true now, because I'm very heavy and deep now into neuroscience and neuroplasticity and the subconscious mind and all that stuff. But what I recognize now was it wasn't that they weren't bad people. I exhibited behaviors. I was jealous. I was suspicious, all of those things, because I was always so concerned in the back of my mind that someone was going to leave me and cheat on me, that I really believe now I pushed women towards that. Yep. That maybe never would have, but they ended up doing it because I kind of led them that way,
Right.
So Dave, that was the beginning of it for me, was broken relationships. And I began to realize by the time I got, towards the tail end of that, when I did get married, we were married almost 5 years. The last 8 months or so is when I had that life-changing experience of I gave my life to God. For me, that was pivotal. So that was a part of it. But that's when I began to realize, gosh, I am not the man that I want to be. I am not the kind of husband that I want to be. We actually went through 8 months of faith-based marriage counseling. And especially, it was a couple who had been doing it 36 years. And the guy, his name was Jack. Jack, I'll never forget them. And he kept pointing back at me. I kept wanting to talk about her, I kept wanting to say, no, you don't understand. But she does this and she does this. And he's like, no. And it's when I began to realize that, man, I've got some really core issues that need to be dealt with. And one of those was I had slowed down the meth. We didn't really do that very often at this point. But I remember the very last time I did it, I was like 30-ish, 30, no more than 31. I was about 30. And we went out and did it. And, you never wake up feeling fresh as a daisy doing meth, right? But that particular morning, I woke up and I didn't feel great, which I expected. And that's when I used the word. I was disgusted. Like, how did you become this dude?
Right.
And so I quit meth cold turkey. That was the end of it. That is not going to be a part of my life. That is done forever. That's been, 30 years ago now. And I was done with that. Now, building my character, becoming the man that I wanted to be, especially once she divorced me, I felt like I was going to get another chance. That was a longer journey in which I needed to seek out help from people that, actually were the kind of husband and father that I knew I wanted to be, and that kind of thing.
Right. And the fact that you became open to the idea of going to church was
Mm.
is interesting. But then
Yeah.
of that, I'm sure your circles had to change significantly, right? The people you were around.
Yeah, that's a funny story too. I'll go through that one quickly. I was not raised in church. I don't even remember having, friends that I had some friends that were Mormon, and so they were ones that I played ball with that I knew had a religion, and knew that they lived according to a certain standard or whatever. Beyond that, I really don't remember. And I did go to church a few times. I had a small, like 2 month period when I was 19 that I was going to church with my roommate for a little bit, but nothing that I felt like really took, right? And so by the time I was 31, it was business. I was in business. I was in a network marketing company, a health and nutritional company. And I should throw that in just really fast too. That's when I started taking better care of my body as well and putting some good things in it, which I think everything goes together, right? Mind, body, soul, and spirit, it's all connected. So I did start treating my body better. But through that company, I was being mentored by a young woman, her and her husband, but mostly her, that were uber successful, like cover of Success magazine kind of successful. And they were just killing it. And they were believers. And so they invited me to church, I don't know how many times. And finally, one day I went, and this is really the truth. I did not go because I was trying to find God consciously, because I was trying to find God or, faith or anything at all. I recognized one very important thing about them that I didn't have. And now I have a term for it. It's the word peace. I didn't have the language, but I recognized that they would have things that didn't go their way too. And they responded very differently. They always had a calm about them. They still had a joy even in the midst of some trying times. And I didn't, when things didn't go my way, it was like I was just all over the map emotionally and in my mind. So I just said, all right, well, I'll go check out this thing they do, right? And I ended up, that's a whole other story. I had quite an experience that day, but, ended up giving my life to God. And that did, it really did. It began to really put me on a very different trajectory. I would say morally, I would even say with believing in myself that I could be better.
Right. What was the first thing you learned about yourself? Like as you started to go down that path with these people, with religion, with God, whatever you want to call it. What's the first thing you realized about yourself that you may have been blind to up until that point?
Okay. Yeah. Blind to, that's a different question because I was thinking your lead just in general, which would have been the very first thing was I need to be a better man and I need to treat women differently. So that was the negative side of things. That's no one has asked me that I can remember either. Thank you for that question. That company that I joined where I met, her name was Kimber. It was it was a network marketing company, but there was a lot of believers involved, but it also was a company that did a lot of workshops and seminars and things like that were personal development type stuff. And it was the first time in my life where I had multiple people pouring into me and telling me, you've got a gift, you can be better. My speaking gift came out pretty quickly in that business. And I had, strangers and, mentors coming up to me saying, man, you are really gifted in this. You could really do something. You've got a great personality. You're really someone that people trust. There was just a lot of people speaking life into me that I began to really believe for the first time that I could be my version of great.
Yep. Yep. It's so interesting to hear you say that. And it's not about me, but I can't help it to
Yeah, come on.
as you're saying, is when I first would hear those things as a younger person, I did not believe those things from other people. I didn't know if they were shitting on me or not.
Right.
Or they were trying to make me feel good or just give me some throwaway compliment because for the most part, I didn't hear those things at the house.
Right.
When somebody else would say it, I'm like, are you fucking with me? You know what I mean? Like I would immediately go down that path. And it took me a long time to even be open to it. Did you ever doubt their sincerity? I know that you're in a safe space.
Sure.
Is this just your way of trying to make me feel good? Is this like a fake compliment? Did you ever have that thought?
Oh, like yesterday. Right. I mean, for real, I definitely had it consistently in those early years and again, I think what I would learn later, once again, when I began to understand how our subconscious really works and how those trauma points when we're young just find a way of re-replicating things, right? I think it wasn't for me so much that I didn't believe them, that they were like purposely lying to me or, like you said, shitting me or whatever, you know. I don't think for me it was so much of that as, nah, you just don't know me. Like you don't really know me, you know.
Right.
Like I know what you think you see, but I don't think you really know me. And
Yeah.
then, and then years later, I would say, especially the last, 20 years for me in particular, I began to believe.
Yeah.
Began to believe. But it's still a journey, Dave. It's still a journey. We don't arrive, right? My whole life is all about how can I incrementally get a little bit better today
Yep.
or do better than I did,
Well, the other thing that strikes me in your story is you were always a person that other people would approach with,
Oh, yeah.
tell you anything. And there was a time where maybe you, in a very, I don't know, there was probably something very comfortable about you that caused you to want to participate in that conversation as a helper. And I can relate to that as well. And to look back, when I look back now on conversations that I had when I was so like mentally not on the right track, giving advice to people.
Right.
I think back sometimes on what the hell was I talking about? I was projecting as if I knew better, and maybe the advice was right, but I didn't know what the hell I was doing because I wasn't living it. So, and again, I never got into the drugs or anything like that. But it's not like my life was like fundamentally on track. But that's the other thing I consider that the skill set was there, but the actual living and doing and living the right life wasn't there yet. So, what
Right.
about that for you? Where
Go ahead.
no, well, you're still kind of that same person that people go to. The work you do right now is still very much the same as maybe when you were 12 helping a friend, but now you know something that you didn't know and have
Yeah.
processed something that you didn't process.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a quick example of the extreme of when I was not capable, and yet people would still ask me, and I have a point to make when I share this part. I remember we were partying. It was after the bar closed down. My best friends ran a bar, so we'd all, close down the bar, and then this is the meth days, so we would go and we'd party sometimes for an entire day. It was just crazy. And there came a point where the stores were still open and everybody left the party except this young woman that I just started to get to know, her and her husband, and he went with them. Everybody went to go get more beer. And I found myself sitting with her, and we're literally doing lines of meth and we're just talking. And she ends up literally looking at me going, I don't know why I'm telling you this. I've never told really anybody, and my husband doesn't even know, but I was raped when I was a young girl. And she starts going through this, incredibly vulnerable, intimate part of her life, And I don't know what I told her, Dave. I know my heart went out to her. I know I had, empathy for her, and I said something. Clearly, I was not equipped to give her any real, real valuable help at that point. But I think what you find and I bet you this is true about you as well. There is something inherent in us when you're gifted a certain way for helping people work through stuff that I think they somehow recognized your trustworthiness, because the one characteristic that I did have is confidentiality. When people would share stuff with me, I did not reshare it. And I think somehow some people just sense that you're safe to talk to, even when you're at a point in your life when you don't have the wisdom to help steer them maybe in a better, healthier direction, right? And so, ultimately, as I've studied and learned and grown and all those things over the years, that's one of the exciting things about doing what I do now is, now, of course, I'm I guess the whole package, if you could say it that way. I've had the life experience. I've, studied tremendously on, emotional intelligence and the mind and all those things. And so now I can help people, but it's been interesting. I don't know if that answered the question exactly as you asked it, but it's been interesting to see there is so much common ground to who I really was, but now I'm just in a much healthier place as a human being, body, mind, soul, and spirit. And I've learned some things along the way that I can actually help people move the needle in their life.
So, what caused you to want to do that? Once you started getting your own affairs in order,
Yeah.
what,
Yeah.
this is what I want to do. I want to do this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that it was super conscious. I've never been, and this is not to me a negative or a positive. I think we're all a little bit different, but I've never been like the 5-year, 10-year planner, mapped everything out. So it wasn't so much of that. And, I always loved helping people, which I've already established. But when I moved from California to Dallas, where I live now, I really thought I was being called into full-time ministry in a church. I didn't know what that looked like. I just knew that that was a clear path to helping people. So I wasn't necessarily intent on being a pastor, or I knew I had a speaking gift. I knew I wanted to do that some way, but ultimately I moved 2,000 miles, here to Dallas. I'd never been here. I literally moved believing this is where I was called to do. I sold all my possessions, but my car, moved here with a couple of friends, didn't have a job, when I arrived, had never visited, literally just showed up and expected that God was on my side and things are going to start happening today, And, ironically, Dave, they didn't. They didn't. It was like 2 years later. I got involved. I was in sales up to that point. So I got a sales job, ended up managing a wireless store back in the early days of wireless when, Nokia was still, number one, that kind of stuff. And just questioned what the heck, I moved away from everything I knew. I'm believing that God's guiding me. So it's like, why am I here? But he promised me 3 things. This ended up being the cool part of it. Because even though for 2 years I was really questioning, he said, I'm going to bring you a mentor, which I got my mentor within the first 2 months, very rapidly.
Okay.
I'm going to bring you the bride of your youth, which was a term that didn't make any sense to me. I ended up discovering later that it was actually in a scripture, and sure enough, I've been remarried now for 21 years and we've had an incredible marriage from day one. That's a whole other story. That's a beautiful story. But that was the second. And then the third one is that I felt like this is where he was going to launch me in ministry. So it didn't take the path that I had expected, but I began to volunteer and help young adult men just navigate life. And so even though I wasn't doing that professionally or paid to get, do that vocationally, I did start doing that pretty quickly. And then ultimately I would end up in ministry. I actually was a pastor for 17 years up until 2023. So that was a big chunk of my life. But to answer your question, I never felt like it was this crystal clear, I'm going to do fill in the blank. It was more so just, I want to help people. And I was just looking for what path is going to guide me to that. And that's ultimately how I ended up becoming a pastor. And by the way, I told people for not the full 17 years, but for probably the latter 5 to 7 years, I'm not a pastor. I'm not. And they're like, no, you are. I'm like, no, I'm really not. I'm not a pastor. I know I'm supposed to be doing something else. And of course now I am, but
it's an amazing story. Tell me about the types of challenges that you've helped people with, or during that time as a pastor, or whatever you want to call yourself. What are some of the things, without divulging specifics about people, but some of the circumstances that you help people navigate that ultimately you had to lean on in your own personal life later on?
Oh gosh. Yeah. And there's so many, I got my start in ministry, and makes some people chuckle. I didn't grow up in the church, but people who grew up in the church, when I say what I'm about to say, are going to go, are you kidding me? I became a youth pastor at 40 years old. And by the way, had never attended a youth service in my entire life. So, I actually, no joke. Actually, the church I was a part of before I got hired somewhere else to become a pastor, I actually went to one of the youth services because I had just gotten hired. I'm like, I've never even seen one. I don't even know what to do. What does this look like? But that's how it started. And I think, interestingly enough, again, you bring your whole life with you, right? And so that wasn't the normal path. Most people aren't hiring a 40-year-old married with, at that time, let's see. Yeah, we had our first 2 at that time. So 2 boys. That's not your typical first choice for a youth pastor. Right. And I think the reason why that's significant, Dave, is even though that was my initial role, was youth and actually young adult pastor at the same time, I brought with that a different dynamic. So I was very quickly thrown into marriage ministry as well. Within the first few months, I was barely a pastor, and I was overseeing the marriage side of things as well. And so that began. And then over the course of, that full 17 years, because of kind of that role that I had, that I ultimately would become head over multiple departments, but I was a family guy. I had a connection with youth. I had a connection with young adults. I had this kind of broad influence, I guess you would say. So I experienced helping people with just about everything you can possibly imagine. I mean, we had lots of marriages that were broken, especially if they were in distress and on the verge of divorce. That tended to be the ones that ended up in my wife and I's lap. We death. Been in hospital rooms while someone watched their mother pass away, or a stillborn child. I've been in that room. Just a lot of abuse, more so with women. It does happen with men too, but physical abuse of women, and trying to help them navigate, how do I get out of this safely? And financial, I mean, I just can't hardly think of anything really that I probably haven't encountered by now. But to your point, I never felt like I was always 100% equipped for every single situation. But I think this is a point I want to make to anybody that has a heart to help other people. You don't have to live someone else's life. You don't have to have experienced exactly what they have experienced to be a help to someone. You just have to love someone enough and be willing to, get your hands a little bit dirty, and be willing to and sometimes it's just being a sounding board and nothing more. And then sometimes it's really getting deep in there with them and helping them, whether it's with their mindset, their belief system, whether it's, a guy who's cheated on his wife and his wife wants to give it a go. So now how do we get this guy to a place where he's actually trustworthy, whatever it is, I think it starts with, here's what I believe. And this is what I sense about you from the day we first talked. Again, it goes back to that trustworthiness. I know you're credible in what you do. I really believe that. I've done some research on you. I've trolled you. I've done all that stuff too. But the reason is because we've shared some things with one another. We have life experiences. I don't regurgitate principles that I've read somewhere. When I help someone, or when I speak, when I do my speaking engagements, whether I did a leadership thing for Starbucks, I've done different things, when I'm doing those, I'm speaking from a place of someone who's actually lived this out and either conquered it or is in the process of conquering it. And I think people really gravitate towards that, and it helps people to know that I'm not perfect. I haven't done anything perfect. Right. I've still, chunked things up. Yeah. But I every day wake up trying to be resolute that I'm going to help someone today, somehow, some way.
I can only imagine how you must have felt in those moments where you just know, I'm not equipped to deal with this story or this circumstance. Like, what do you look for in that moment with people where you don't have an answer? You don't even have words. You could be listening. You could be listening, but what do you do with what you're hearing?
Yeah. You know what? That's a great question that I don't know when or even if we want to go there, but with what we experienced, in the last 5 years with our oldest son, I think those situations and seasons of being thrown in that with other people when they're going through it have definitely informed a lot on how I have walked out our own personal life. And to the point of your question, I think I learned pretty quickly during those seasons that it's okay to not know what to say. That's when you just present yourself as, listen, I love you and I'm here. And let them tell you what they need. And sometimes it is. Sometimes just being a sounding board, like I said a few moments ago, it's really just listening and letting somebody sometimes it's puking all over you, right? It's just, whatever the rage or whatever it is. And then sometimes it's, maybe it's deep grief or whatever. But just knowing that sometimes you don't have the right thing to say. And then I think on the other side of that, when you do speak, is I've been very careful to be very sensitive to where that person is at. Like, for example, with grieving, especially if someone's lost a loved one, there are different phases. There's no formula, but there are different phases of grief that pretty much everybody experiences on some level. And so being aware of that and where they are at and what they're believing about their current story, you have to be sensitive to those things, because I can't take someone somewhere where they're not ready to go. Yeah. And that's, Dave, you know this, that's the hardest part when you're deep in coaching people and helping people with their life, is there's way too many times where you want what you can see for them and the gifts you see in them and the ability and their, the perseverance that is in there, that they can overcome anything. You see it more than they do sometimes, and you can't take them further than they're willing to go. So I think I just learned pretty quickly in those seasons that, one, don't talk if I don't have something that I feel very confident is helpful, and secondly, don't try to take them further than they're ready to go.
So I want you to tell your story about Gabriel. I want to also ask, how do you, and maybe you can tell this as you tell his story, but how important is it to you, for you in what you do, or me and what I do, to be aware of how a person thinks and the meaning they attach to their thoughts, and how hard that can be to undo and may never get undone to solving, say, a problem?
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. So with my experience, because I do feel like the story I'm about to tell has radically transformed my life, even though I'm still doing a lot of the same things. I mean, I'm still helping people. I've been a speaker for many, many years, long before this part of our story, all that stuff. But it is, if I could say it this way, it has elevated my game, because I had to go through all this firsthand. And so what we're talking about here is I mentioned early on, I've had both experiences in life. You've heard some of the downs and some of the, negative things, if you want to say it that way. And I also said there were some pinnacles. Well, by the time, I got married to Amaryllis, that's my bride of 21 plus years. And we, had, by the time we get to this part of my story, we had 3 boys at that point. And we'd been through some stuff. My youngest was born at 1 pound, 14 ounces, 2.5 months early. She was basically dying in childbirth, and they had to take him. And so, we had some other rocky roads, but man, by the time, 2015 to 2019 rolls around, we're feeling like we are just on course. Everything is going our way. Ministry was going well, our family, our marriage, our boys were killing it, and whatever they were doing. And so ultimately what happened was, my oldest, Gabriel, he had a dream from the time he was very young to become a pilot. And there's reasons for that. His uncle Danny actually owns a little airport. He doesn't work there full time. It's just more of a hobby in rural Oklahoma. And so as a young boy, he went up in a real small aircraft, and it just got in his veins. And so by the time he was 14, we ended up moving. We had moved away from where we are here, we're in McKinney, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. We had lived away for a while doing ministry. When we came back, we didn't even know that our school district here had a 4-year educational aviation program, which there may be a few more now, but that was not common at all in, that at that time. And so we're like, oh my gosh, what another amazing door opening, right? And then he ends up finding this club when he's a freshman that is about 7 minutes from our house. It's an airport here in McKinney. And there's a guy who started a club, and he's mentoring teenagers and teaching them how to overhaul engines and paint and, do all kinds of stuff with the physical side of working on an aircraft. And by the time they turn 16, giving them an opportunity to learn to fly if they'd like to do that. Well, Dave, everything's lined up. I mean, everything's lined up. We were pastors at that time. And despite what people hear in the news occasionally with certain big ministries, we were not knocking down a 6-7 figure income, right? We couldn't afford to take him through that. But he ended up getting a $1,000 scholarship totally on his own from American Airlines. And the way the guy structured this, his name is Kevin Lacey, amazing dude. And the club was called Tango 31. The way he structured it is the flight instructors all donated their time for the kids. And all that he had to pay for was the wholesale gas price. And that's it. Wow. So everything was just going our way, dude. It was just like, life is good. And at 16, he soloed for the first time before he could even drive in a car by himself. And then at 17, that's the youngest you can be to become a licensed pilot. He indeed became a licensed pilot. And, he had graduated a year early from high school. You see some guitars behind me. He taught himself to play guitar. He was not a professional photographer in the literal sense, but he was so talented. People actually hired him to do professional gigs. I mean, he was just on this amazing trajectory. So were the rest of our family, And then September 23rd of 2019, it was just a regular day. And, at that point, he'd been flying for about 7 months at that point. And, it's all about the hours. So you're just flying every chance you get. And he had an opportunity to fly to Arkansas, which is, just a few hour flight from here, to take a friend back to school. And then he was going to turn right back around and come back. And he had just started a new job the day before that he was super excited about. And he dropped her off safely. And on the way back, he would get about 20 minutes out of Fayetteville, Arkansas. And it would take us about 2 years for the NSAB or NTSB to rule on it. But he ran into an unexpected weather system and he crashed and lost his life. And our lives were turned completely upside down in an instant. It's every parent's absolute worst nightmare. And so, Dave, I don't know how, we don't need to get into that too deep as far as just, what that does to you as a parent, but, it was devastating. But here I have, my other sons at this stage are 9 and 14. And so one had just began his freshman year of high school. The other one was still in elementary. And so, that was a demand on my life and my leadership as a dad and as a husband that, I don't know that I had any choice. I don't feel like I'm some big hero in this thing. But I knew we needed to figure out really quick because of all of my life experiences. This is where those things begin to stack up because of all those things I experienced with other families and tried to help people through because of the marriages that you see or you hear about that implode when especially a child is lost. Right. Very common for families to disintegrate. And so that morning, I'll give you this much because it was really just the foundation to where we even are today is I looked at them and I really felt God spoke to me. So I'm not going to take credit for it, but I just looked at them and I said, okay, guys, we have two choices. We can choose the rest. And this is the morning of we have two choices. We can choose to be trapped in the tragedy of this, the way Gabriel died, all the things that we're not going to experience now, because he had his dreams and he was killing it, but we had our dreams for his life too, right? And all of those, just disappeared. And I said, if we get trapped in that, then we're all going to be shadows of who we were created to be. But there's a second choice, and that second choice is we're going to choose to honor Gabriel and honor God, but we're going to choose to honor Gabriel by living the way he lived. And I had to be specific with the boys. I said, that doesn't mean you don't need to do what your brother did, but and later on we would do this TV interview where I would end up saying the phrase, he lived big, bold, and brave. I don't even remember saying it, it was very early on, but that's how we calibrated that morning. It's like, we are going to live the way he lived. We are going to attack life. This is not, it's crushing, but it's not going to permanently crush us. We are going to respond as a family. And the second part of that was, guys, I don't know what it's going to look like as we grieve, but we are going to do this as a family. We're going to do it openly. I don't care. Cussing is not really, it happens in our family. It's not like we never do. I cuss sometimes. But it's not like that's a regular way we roll, especially with our younger boys, But I told them at that time, I said, listen, you need to know that nothing is off limits as you go through this grieving process. If you are pissed off and angry, I don't care if you're angry at God, angry at Gabe, whatever it is, you need to cuss, you need to cry. And we're going to have joyful moments too. And we have, where we're going to think of something funny he did because he was a knucklehead sometimes. As much of a dreamer and achiever as he was also a total knucklehead at times, And we're gonna experience all of that. And we're gonna do it together. And so we began to walk that out one day at a time. And I'm going to throw this at you, and then we'll just see where you want to go with it. Because this is, I've probably mentioned this at some point with someone because I've done a lot of interviews, but it's not a common topic. Less than a couple of months later, after we lost Gabriel, we had a set of friends that were missionaries, and they had returned from Turkey, and they asked if we would be willing to go have lunch with them. And so we did. And they had 3 young kids at that time, 2 of which were teenagers. And the course of the conversation was basically, how are you guys even breathing? How is your faith still strong? All that stuff. So that was that. Then a few weeks later, maybe a month, another just happened to be missionaries. That's just, I don't know why, it's just the fact. There were some other missionaries that we got to know that there were missionaries in Africa that happened to have family 20 minutes from our house. We didn't even know it. So they came to visit. They also had teenagers. Same exact story. Went to lunch, had these conversations, and they're just like, I don't know how I could ever, deal with it. So a total of 6 months after Gabriel passed, within 10 days of each other, they both lost a teenager to a tragic accident.
Oh my God.
And I was like, okay. And again, for me, this is, a big part of my faith journey too. I'm like, God, I don't know what you're doing. I don't, I felt unprepared. We were 6 months ahead of him.
Right.
Okay. Um, and yet, he immediately started using us to, and I would just say it this way, because to me, the first year I call it in my book, I call it the shock and awe phase. You got all the birthdays, you've got, different events and holidays and different things. And it's all your first time, with that just massive void. And, next thing I know, we're just thrown into, we're already helping people with this too. And we're just barely breathing. And so all of those experiences just began to kind of stack on one another. And I don't know where you want to go with this, because there's a lot of ways you can go with this. I'll just bounce it back to you and see what you're sensing.
Oh, like I'm at a place where my words are so limited right now. The question I think that keeps running through my head is Gabriel, and do you do you actually feel his presence more in death, maybe in some
Mm,
ways than you did in life?
yeah, boy. You know what? That's gosh, Dave, you're killing it today, man. I think that's two questions. I've done like 100 of these. I am certain nobody has asked me that. That is such a profound question. I would answer it this way. The physical aspect of him not being present is definitely always with us, and it always will be. And I've said many times that I don't believe, some people believe that grieving, you just like, there's an X amount of time, whatever that is, and you've stopped grieving. I think that's total BS. And I've done a lot of interviews with clinical therapists and stuff like that too. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean the part of the grieving where you're like just barely trying to breathe and you're just barely trying to function, but there's still an element of the void of that person not being physically present in so many of life's moments, that's still very real. But to your question, and I've never even thought about it until you posed it, I would say 100% that I sense the presence of the most intimate part of who he was, the value that he brought to this world, the energy that he brought to this world. There's parts of his story that I didn't tell for sake of time, but he could connect with anybody, and he did. And we ended up hearing story after story after story. Here's the funny thing as a parent, we didn't think he was we never thought any of our kids were bad kids, but he didn't talk much about, things he did for people. We ended up finding out all kinds of things he did for people that we had no clue. And so just that, Big Bull Brave came out of that I feel his presence all the time in terms of his zest for life, his desire to do something significant, because he was absolutely going to do something big. And I think for his age, he was doing something big, right? And I think I feel his presence anytime, in particular, if I'm feeling like, I don't know if I can give it the effort today or whatever. And that's part of why, people feel differently. Not everybody feels the same way about tattoos, that kind of stuff. I got my first one when I was 54 years old. Not because I had anything against it, just I never felt I had a compelling enough reason. And I put this is one of the first things I did about 4 months after he passed away. And people aren't going to be able to see the whole thing. It's got a whole story to it, but it's got Big Bull Brave on it. And I put it on my body for a reason, because to me, this is not any kind of a gesture about his death. This is a gesture about the way he lived life. And so I feel that presence, Dave. I really do. I feel that presence when, especially if I feel like I'm not equipped for something. I've stepped out into some new things that I'd never done before that, a little scary. I look down at that and I sense him with me. You can't see it, but there's a picture of one of the pictures that was taken of him in a plane right in front of me. He absolutely is very present in my life in ways that I didn't experience him as my son, right, who's younger, who's just living life, if that makes sense. And I believe that to also be true for my bride and my other two boys as well.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And so I would think that when you live your life doing whatever it is that you're doing every single day, you've got you're almost fueled by a responsibility to him,
Yeah.
you
No,
know?
I kind of set myself up for that too,
Yeah.
because when I decided that I was going to launch out my own speaking brand and start speaking corporately instead of just in churches and on all that kind of stuff and label it big, bold, brave, he's the inspiration behind that. People go to my website, there's a page that's just, it's a brief part of it, but dedicated to his story. And it's even got a few videos of him flying and just, the joy of him doing what he loved to do. But exactly, that was a decision that I made. And I think as a family, it's been really important that we made that decision as well, that we were going to honor him by living our life to the fullest, whatever that ended up looking like. And
Yeah.
so I take him with me in whatever I do. And so do the boys. I think now as a parent, I want to say this because I think this is really important. I think it's also very important to balance that we're living for ourselves first. I'm living for myself. It's my path. I'm not carrying a weight or a burden in any way to keep his memory alive. I don't feel that way at all. It's just a natural part of what I'm doing. And as a dad, when I tell his story, I had a great opportunity to do this a couple of weeks ago in front of a bunch of community leaders, just bringing his story into it. Love to do that. But I have to be very careful as a parent not to let that become the focal point, because my other two boys, one's a sophomore at Oklahoma State pursuing business. The other one's a freshman in high school. They're very gifted. They're very talented. They have their own journey ahead of them, and they deserve their attention as well. So I think we've been pretty good at that, of finding that balance between, not living for him, but him still being an ongoing part of our story as a family, as all of our lives emerge and as we grow up.
The other thing I've heard you talk about, I get some, sorry if I'm making a mess of my face here. You also have talked about grieving and the importance of grieving. So even though on the first day you pulled your wife and sons aside and made this commitment to living for, we're gonna move through this together for him and all that stuff. But at the same time, you still grieved, and you still have to process this forever. It's never gonna go away. Talk a little bit about that, because that's just as critical to moving forward as well.
Yeah, it is. And so, I'm going to be cautious as I do this, because again, there's no 1, 2, 3, there's not this exact formula for anybody. And so anytime I'm talking about this, whether it's on an interview with someone like you, or whether I'm just having a casual conversation, this is our story. This is the way it rolled out for us. And the things I'm about to describe, nothing we did perfectly. We still had our ups and downs and times where we weren't fully living that way and allowed ourselves to kind of get caught up for a period of time. And whether it was getting way too close to spiraling into depression, or, whatever it happened to be. And I've got some stories I could share with that. But ultimately, there's a few very key things that we did starting that morning that even when we would start to get off track a little bit, we recalibrated to very quickly, that I have since discovered in doing a lot of the study that I've done, in neuroscience, neuroplasticity, the study of the mind and all that. And then also I've done several interviews with clinical therapists and psychologists, and discovered that there's science to back up the healthy way in which we walk this out. And one of those is allowing yourself to grieve. And this is where it gets a little dicey for some people, because a lot of people bury it. But the evidence is very clear. There's just so much data behind it now, that people who bury pain and don't allow themselves to feel the full gamut of emotions suffer, and the people around them suffer. And they, again, it all goes back to your subconscious mind. They act out in ways that they don't even recognize that it's that pain that caused it. And they're living it out every single day. And they're a shell of really who they should be, because they haven't allowed themselves to grieve it out. So I want to hit a couple of highlights. People can get my book if they want to get my book, even though it's not a book just on grieving. There's many other, amazing stories in it, but they all, like we've been kind of on this journey through my life, they all kind of layer together and can help somebody big time that's going through this. But I'll tell you, the first one was that choosing life. Like we're going to live the way that was paramount. The second one was the grieving process. Here's a simple example of what it would look like. You go about a normal day as a family after you've lost someone like this, and there can be a day where everybody looks like they're just fine because we're just getting through it, right? And I call them courageous conversations, which, admittedly is a little bit of branding, but but it fits. I call it courageous conversations, and what that would look like from time to time, and it could go in both directions. I may sit down with my wife. We have a pretty set pattern for 21 years of we spend some time sitting on the couch. It may be watching a TV show, it may just be talking, but we spend time together. And it may have been what appeared to be a normal day. And we would just turn to each other. And if it was me turning to her, I just look, and we just kept it simple. How are you doing with Gabriel? Mm-hmm. And Dave, sometimes it'd be, I'm okay. Yeah. I'm okay. Today was a good day, And other times that smile that was there right before that question got dropped disappeared in an instant, and break down and cry, and the pain would come to the surface. And I called that a courageous conversation because the problem that so many people run into, that I've discovered, doing a lot of these interviews too and talking to experts, is people are afraid that they're going to be a trigger, even within, the close family unit. I don't want to say anything to her because it seems like maybe today's a good day. Well, we know what suicide has done to our country. We know, especially since COVID, I'm not trying to make a political statement, but teen suicide rates have gone through the roof over the last few years, right? And in so many of those cases, people end up saying, I had no idea. And the reason is because they're not willing to have those really hard conversations at times, because you don't want to ask it, because one, you don't want to see them get emotional. And maybe you're feeling pretty decent, you don't want to go into that and feel it, but you have to. And so that's something that we did on a regular basis. And again, not every time was emotional. Sometimes it was like, I'm okay. I'm okay today. But then there were times where we needed to be able to talk through it. And we established that as a family. I want to say this, and then I want to bounce it back to you. When I say we talked to the boys who, again, this started when they were 9 and 14. So I had to use terms that they understood. But we made it very clear to them. It's not that you need to make sure you're always telling us if you're feeling any kind of way, but then mom and dad are just going to put on this front, and we're just going to be, especially me as the father figure, right? I'm going to put on this front, and guys, I'm just going to be the head cheerleader. No, it was, we're going to be honest with each other. So I've grieved in front of my boys. I've cried in front of my boys. And it's taught them, and this is what I've learned, through the journey, it's taught them a very healthy coping mechanism, that there are sometimes in life when, guys, tears matter and they help. As a matter of fact, this is a really cool side note. The science has discovered that even the chemical makeup of tears chemically is very different. You probably know this already. Very chemically different, that like a tear of joy and excitement versus a tear of grieving, chemically very different. So you're literally, detoxifying your body when you allow yourself to grieve in the open. So we did that as a family in both directions, not just kids, you need to do it, and I'm going to be the man of the house. It was everybody all in, and we would recalibrate when, we weren't living it out.
What about people? What about people outside the family? It tends to be hardest on, a friend or an extended family member, or even a stranger, not knowing what to do or say in those moments where they become just as awkward. But as somebody going through that, or who has gone through that, can you remember the first person outside of the family that you felt like, I can just be myself right now. I can drop my guard. I can cry. I can say. And what was it about that person?
Yeah. Well, okay. So at that time, we had launched a church. It was the first time that we had planted a church, and it was very early in the phase. We'd only launched it about 4 months before Gabriel passed away. So at that time, we had 8 families, and we were just meeting in my home. So, it wasn't a big thing. It wasn't, in a building or anything. And there was a couple of families in particular that we were quote unquote the pastors, but I really saw them as, friends and equals. And they were paramount in those early stages. and I would say the entire church, and again, we're not talking to a ton of people, but
Right.
I would say even the teenagers and kids, that were part of the families that were involved in that, everybody was so good about not trying to avoid that we lost Gabriel, because some people, that's their way of going about it. And we have people, Dave, that, this happens to everybody, that we've known for years and years and years, that we've never heard from again. And I really think it's because they don't know what to do with it. And rather than have a courageous conversation, I'll throw my branding back in there. They just don't. And I think it's not a heart issue in terms of they don't love you. I think what happens is they probably get a month, 6 months, a year, 2 years, and they're probably embarrassed at that point that they haven't reached out to you. And I want to weave in a couple of things, because this isn't as clean as just one thing. During this process, I allowed those people in, the ones you just asked about, that would allow me just to have conversations and not try to fix anything, and not try to, they'd let you cry, they'd let you feel pain. They wouldn't try to, oh yeah, let me hold you. Don't cry. Don't cry. It's going to be better. They didn't do any of that stuff. They just let us be. And I still to this day tell everybody, the best thing you can do I don't care who it is, it's somebody close to you or somebody not as close to you, when they have lost a loved one, tell them, I love you and I'm here for you. Zip it. In those early phases, that's it. I don't care if you've experienced something. We've experienced what we've experienced. When I encounter somebody who just lost someone, the last thing I say to them is, oh, I know exactly what you're going through, because when I lost my son, people do it all the time. Zip it, because you don't know. You don't know, because it's their own dynamic, right? And so that's a piece of this. I let some people in that allowed us to be us. We helped. And again, I was in ministry, so I'm going to use this term. We ministered to a lot of people in those first few months as well. I would say we helped people more than we were being helped in that very early first few months, because, we were the ones who were dealt the biggest blow. But Gabriel was very connected in the community and with families, and even salty guys who ran aviation companies that I didn't even know he knew, stuff like that. And so we really recognized early on that other people felt the pain too. And so for a few months, there was a lot of that, of helping other people navigate their pain of, a lot of kids, a lot of young people, navigate why should I even care? If Gabriel died, why should I care and even want to pursue anything? Life doesn't matter, all that stuff. But then there comes a point, and again, there's no like 1, 2, 3 exact timeline, but I think all these things ultimately end up weaving in. We ended up needing to, if you want to call it circle the wagons, that's great, to where we really limited who we spent time with.
Based on what?
Based on two things. One is you're going to go through a part of that grieving process in that early phase where the tank is empty. So it wasn't as much about the other people as, I just don't have the capacity to give right now. And I need to be, in my case, man enough, my wife, we had to be aware enough to know the tank is empty right now. They're not my responsibility, whoever that is. God will take care of them. They'll find someone. So that was part of it. And then I already said the other part, which was, there was a small network of people that really just allowed us to do this in a very healthy way. That, of course, those are people that we'd engage and spend more time with. So those were all things, that come into play. But I can't overemphasize the allowing yourself to deal with the real emotions as you go through it. And I want to be cognizant of the fact that we don't know who's going to be listening to this. And maybe you don't have a marriage like I had, or maybe you're single. Maybe you don't have an immediate network of people that you can think of that can be that close knit. You can't do this alone. Yeah, that's another piece. We didn't do it alone. As I just described, it was a small group, but you're going to need other people too. And so in some cases, if you feel alone and you're hearing this right now, you have got to reach out to a professional. There's a lot of great people out there doing a lot of great work that will help you, kind of forget about that whole idea of, well, I'm not someone who needs therapy. Man, you've got to have someone that can help you process this thing out loud. Don't try to do it alone, because that's a recipe for disaster.
On that topic, Clint, it's really hard right now I've talked to a lot of people who want help, need help for different reasons, and they can't find it. You know, the therapist isn't available, the psychologist isn't available, they're 6 months out. And even when they do find it, it doesn't mean that that individual is the right recipe for them. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Oh, I do. Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
what other options do people have? And it may not be due to a loss, it could be something else. But finding professional help is one thing, but finding somebody that you feel understands you, that you connect with. I mean, if you know what I'm saying. I mean,
Yeah.
any advice around that?
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, Dave. I mean, that's just the reality, right? And the truth is, you could be someone who has sought that out and it did not work out for whatever reason, right? But again, I'm still going to make the point. I don't believe we can do this alone. So, one of the things that I found interesting, because we're 5 years into it now, and I've talked to probably thousands of people at this point, I would imagine, is that, there's no one thing that works for everybody exactly the same way either. People ask me, and I'm very honest about it, did we get professional help? And the answer is no, we didn't. I never sought out professional help. And it's not because I don't believe in it. The mechanisms that I already described, with us having a very healthy marriage going into it, and patterns. And this is why I'm going to bring up my book again. I don't sell, but I'm bringing this up for a reason. There's other parts outside the grieving process where I talk about the way we've built our life and the characteristics that we've lived by, especially in our marriage, that 100% I believe helps set us up for success. And so we had that. So we never sought professional help. Now, we did for our middle son for a period,
Okay.
because he was struggling in a different way. And so we absolutely reached out, and it ended up, like you just said, what ended up happening with him is we sent him through a few sessions, someone that, we did our vetting and felt like this is going to be a really great person for him. And he ended up telling us, listen, this isn't working for me. And he wasn't abiding by our family mantra. And he's like, I just want to start talking to you guys.
Okay.
And he did. And we did that as a family. And so, and I can report, thank God, these last 2 years in particular, he is just thriving in life. He's done a complete 180 in so many ways. I mean, there was a lot of things that happened, Dave. He got in some trouble. He, just really put himself in a lot of dangerous situations. We almost lost him 2 years after Gabriel passed away. He hit a median at 75 miles an hour after he snuck out at 1 o'clock in the morning and did 5 flips and came out of a car that everybody on the scene told me, he should be dead, and he's thriving now. So therapy may or may not be the best, for someone. What I wanted to get to is the other thing that I've experienced by doing a lot of these interviews is there's a lot of support groups out there as well. And especially on social media, through whether it's Facebook, whether it's through Instagram, or you can find other ways, you can Google and find support groups. There's a lot of really great support groups out there. And the way I would characterize what is great is if you are joining a support group and all they're talking about is their pain and their suffering and what they've lost and how life is never going to be this, like there's no forward momentum going anywhere in life, get out. Get out. But if you've got one that can have those conversations, and also, because it's not either or, it's both and, you're going to feel both sides of that. If you can find one where people are real in their pain, real with their struggles, but it's with the mindset of, I'm working through this because there's a better tomorrow, and there's more to life, and there's something in this journey for me, which I think was important too. We decided early on that the story we would tell ourselves, because that's really what you and I are talking about. What story are you telling yourself? Because whatever story you tell yourself, that's what you're going to experience over and over again, right? We told ourselves that we're going to use this as a propellant. We're going to use this as something that causes us to constantly keep seeking to be better human beings and to contribute to this world and to help people around us. So if you can find a support group where that's, kind of the atmosphere, then I think that's going to be very healthy. But ultimately, you just have to do something. And if you're a person of faith, it could be that it's your pastor. It could be that you find, if you're a man, maybe you find a guy, in the men's ministry. If you're not a person of faith, you could perhaps even read some books. Sometimes or even podcasts, Dave. I've actually had people tell me some amazing stories of getting healing and getting started in the right direction and being pulled out of their grief by just listening to a podcast. So I think there's a variety of ways that you can get there. My main point of contention with anybody that, is really suffering is you just cannot do it completely independently on your own. You're going to need some sort of external influence and people that are speaking, I like to use the word life, speaking life into you in order to, keep you out of that pit and keep you moving forward.
So I'm glad you keep bringing up the book. So just for those who haven't heard it, even though we've talked about it, what's the name of it? Where can they find it? And if there was one reason to read it, which I'm sure there are many, what would you say what's your reason for reading it if you're somebody out there listening to this?
Yeah. Well, it's called Big, Bold, Brave, How to Live Courageously in a Risky World. And it came out of, yes, the pain of losing Gabriel. So that story's in there. But it also came at a time when we were all turned upside down due to COVID. And I was sick and tired of all of the fear that everybody was suffering from. And for me, that's not a political statement. I'm not going to try and make a point of whether it was, no vax, yes vax, lockdown, no lockdown. That's not my point. Nobody I've talked to, no matter which side they tended to gravitate towards, has disagreed with me that fear was unleashed on our planet in unprecedented ways. And so I got fed up with that. So someone who's going to read my book, if you have suffered major loss, doesn't have to be the loss of a child. Many people have lost careers, came out of nowhere. You and I are just on the tail end of that generation where you get a job, you work there for 30 years, you get the gold watch, and you get your great retirement. And we don't live in that anymore. People have suffered where they've thought they were set for life. And then one morning they wake up and there was a hostile takeover or whatever, and their career is gone. People have woken up to marriages that they somehow thought were okay 25 years. And then the spouse like, I'm out, So anybody that suffered any kind of major loss is going to get some really solid principles that are real. They're not warm and fuzzy. They're like real things that you can sink your teeth into. I have exercises along the way as well. And the second piece of that I would tell you they're going to get out of it is that, we have to choose to be courageous people, period. So it's going to walk you on that journey of challenging you. And we'll leave this when talking about the book. One of the reasons why I wrote the book, and the biggest way that I was challenged on the book, was I looked at Gabriel's life. And even though I had done some good things, it's not like I hadn't done anything good or hadn't been courageous at all, but I recognized that there were areas of my life where I was a coward. I had been asked to write a book for 15 plus years. I don't even know how many strangers would literally come up to me after a speaking engagement. How do I get your book? I'm like, And I realized there were areas in my life where I was a coward. This book is going to challenge you because life is precious. None of us is guaranteed. You and I aren't guaranteed, once we get off this interview. Life truly is precious. We all know that. But this book is going to challenge you to take every day and just be really intentional to become better, to chase your dreams, and to choose to have an impact on this planet. Don't serve just yourself, serve other people along the way.
Amazon, right? So if they want to get it,
you can find it really anywhere. It's available anywhere books are sold, certainly Amazon. And then they can go to my website as well. It's available there, as well as if they want to look at have me, speak their event or whatever.
I feel like I could just keep asking you questions.
I want to turn the table. I wish I had a podcast. I need to do one someday, and I did say I was going to do one, so I need to follow through. But dude, I would love to turn the tables on this because I want to get in your brain so much more.
Oh yeah, there's not much left up there, so I think it'd be a short episode. If there's anything that you can think of that you want to talk about in the future, I'll do this anytime. I mean, there's just so much phenomenal content and such an unbelievably personal story that, like I said to you at the beginning, you were built to do the work you're doing, and I love what you're doing. It's hard to hear it. I mean, I like just getting through it and just trying to find the questions to respond to you is tough without getting choked up. It's just, but I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate the message. I love what you're doing for other people, and I wish you all the best, Clint. And I hope we maintain contact because you're a good dude.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dave. I mean, it's been an honor to be on here. We were introduced through a third party, and I'm so grateful for that. And I feel the same way, dude. There's a major connection here, and I would love to do this with you again. We can talk about that another time, but we're friends for life now.
Absolutely, bud. Thank you.
Thank you.